have a sense of trusting God. So what about the so-called real world out there? I happen to think our worship is very much part of the real world, but sometimes we slip into the idea that there is the world out there and then there's the world in here. And they can certainly be contrasting spaces. Sadly, the Christchurch Muslims found that when the world beyond violently invaded their worship on Friday. How do we go trusting God in that reality? In our context here, apparently we've got a couple of elections coming up. So people tell me anyway. The politicians are in our face every day, reminding us that we've got some elections coming up and asking us to put our trust in them. They say they can make the world better for us. Don't laugh too much now. I certainly do not need to be the one to tell you that we seem to be experiencing more and more broken trust. People we have trusted letting us down. Institutions we've trusted, organisations we've trusted letting us down. Companies we've trusted letting us down. And so on. These broken trusts contribute to us feeling that we're surrounded by fears and anxieties and uncertainties. And we can see many of the practical realities of that lived out every day. We live in a world where most people don't have enough of anything, and too many people have too much of everything. We live in a world that's anxious about global warming. We saw all those kids out in the streets on Friday, quite anxious about global warming and climate change. And the impacts of that on ordinary people in many different places throughout the world, including themselves. We live in a world that brings so much pain and desperation to so many people. We live in a world that's worried about running out, about not having enough, about not having enough done, about not measuring up, about not being safe enough, about not being valued enough, about not being good enough. As individuals and communities, we can feel that sense of threat around us on many sides. So, it's not just Psalm 27, that expression in some of the Psalms that of being surrounded by our enemies. That comes out in quite a few Psalms, and including Psalm 27 today. And people like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and refugees and immigrants have a sense of their traditions and language and culture being threatened. It can be the dominant culture just being so swamping that makes them feel like that. Can be just change especially for immigrants living in a different country, and time and distance from their home. There are in every relationship risks of hurt and abandonment and pain. The world we live in is very much an anxious world. Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann suggests that the Psalms, which are essentially songs of worship, can provide a place of refuge from this anxious world and can provide a place of realignment with God's world. He suggests that even as we live in the world that we do, with very real stresses and very real pain, we long for a different world. And I could hear some of that language also in the video in Timor, that how they lived in their world right now with all the particular experiences of that world, but they longed for a different world, and they hoped for a different world. A world that is sometimes the opposite of what we're experiencing every day. We long for a world that is occupied by God, who appears to be largely excluded from the world we live in. The world we inhabit shapes us whether we like it or not. And so wouldn't it be better to be in a world shaped by God and occupied by God than one that's shaped by all these anxieties and fears and stress and depression? The Psalms have often provided a place of refuge and a place of realignment for God's people. Most of us are familiar with a few Psalm snippets which keep us going through hard times. The Lord is my shepherd. I lift my eyes up to the hills. For God is our refuge and strength, a present help in trouble. Some of the Psalm snippets that are very familiar to us. And these verses bring comfort in times of trouble or pain. And they reassure us of God's presence in our lives. Psalm 27 takes us more deeply into the counter world, if you like, that the Psalms offer by contrasting the world of anxiety with the world of trusting in God. Psalm 27 consistently sort of moves back and forth between the situation that the psalmist finds himself in, so the realities of his everyday life, and the counter world that he longs for, that he finds in God. But unlike us, who like to begin with how hard things are, the psalmist begins with a statement of confidence and trust in God. He announces the goodness of God. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? And so the first half of the psalm is a statement of confidence and trust, faith, safety and security. Even though enemies surround him, even though people tell lies about him, even though adversaries have attacked him, even though, yet I will be confident in God. So the psalmist is not ignoring the world of stress and anxiety and hardship that he lives in. He's reframing it in the context of his trust in God. He recognises that there's no reason to be anxious in the face of some very real troubles, because he's confident in God's presence. And that presence is real despite how things look. And instead of being swept up in a world of anxiety and fear, he looks to the world of the Good Shepherd for help and for rest. I use that image of being at home in the Lord's house. Still, you could say that the beginning of that psalm is a bit idyllic. But then the psalms are known for being raw and honest. And so in the next part of the psalm, the world intrudes on that peaceful interlude, as it always does. Something has upset the peace and tranquility of the first part of the psalm, and the one who was at home in the Lord's house is now feeling lost. God seems distant. The connection seems broken. And we all know that feeling at different times for ourselves. What this prayer or this psalm does is encourages us to keep praying when the way is dark. Even if we're cranky with God, even if we're spitting chips with God, even if we're angry, even if we're crying out in anguish and despair, keep talking with God. We will keep connected or in relationship if we just keep talking with God, no matter how we do that. The Psalms are full of this openness and honesty with God. It doesn't have to be all nice and pleasant. The confident centre of this part of the psalm is that God will not abandon us, even though those closest to us may do that. The Psalms teach us that it's not only God's responsibility to find us, sometimes we must also fight to stay in this relationship with God. We must go forward confident that God's seeming absence does not equal abandonment. It is the fear talking to us, trying to steer us away from the incredible love of God. Instead, this psalm invites us to contemplate not the evil of the world, but to believe in the goodness of the Lord. And in the goodness of the Lord, we can wait, we can hope, we can trust. The English translations always struggle with that last verse. They all come up with different words: wait sometimes, hope sometimes, trust for the one Hebrew word. To be courageous until this storm also passes. As we enter the season of Lent and approach Easter, we can recall Jesus going before us in this tough ask of holding on when things get tough and of being able to trust in God. Even as Jesus approaches Jerusalem and his death, his lament is not that he's going to be killed. His lament is that the people of Jerusalem have rejected God's love and cannot see another way of being. That is choosing love over fear, trusting in God's way. In choosing to follow this path, Jesus addresses the root of much of our human brokenness, the failure to trust in God and to trust in God's way. Jesus, upon his death on the cross, trusts God with every breath. He's naked before God's sight, totally vulnerable, totally exposed. He keeps nothing back. He cracks his heart wide open to make room for God's promise. Father, he says as he's dying, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Even when he's feeling abandoned and sensing the absence of God, he's still talking and praying to God and trusting in God. And so we cannot help ourselves but sing praise and thanksgiving for God's never-ending love, which rises above all fears and defeats even death. This love gives us hope. Amen.